We all think we know the story of how John Lennon died. It's one of those moments in history. A crazed fan, a senseless act, a tragic but simple story. Well, today, we're going to dig into a much darker, far more complex theory, one that suggests the world's most famous rock star wasn't a random victim at all, but a political target. Okay, let's get into it. So picture the scene on that cold December night. It was just total chaos. John Lennon is bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. His wife, Yoko Ono, is holding him, screaming. And just a few feet away stands his killer, Mark David Chapman. But he isn't running. He's just eerily still, casually flipping through a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He just waited. When the doorman at the Dakota building screamed at him, "Do you know what you've done?" Chapman's reply was so simple, so matter-of-fact, it was chilling. No emotion at all. With that one sentence, the who was never in doubt. But the why? Well, that's where the story we all know starts to get really complicated. And that is the heart of what we're talking about today. Was this really just about a disturbed man trying to get famous, or was Chapman a pawn in a much bigger, much more sinister game? Let's start with the official narrative, the one we've all been told. For decades, the world has pretty much accepted what's called the lone nut theory. And you can see why, right? It's a clean, simple explanation for something that felt completely and utterly senseless. The story goes that Chapman was just an unstable guy who wanted to be famous. Look, the prosecution needed a motive, and they didn't really have one, so they went with a classic. Chapman did it for the attention. He was obsessed with fame, and by killing the most famous person on the planet, he'd become infamous himself. It's a tidy story that let them close the case nice and quick. But here's where that simple story starts to get some serious cracks in it. And it comes from the one person who spent the most time with Chapman right after the murder, Detective Arthur O'Connor. He studied him intensely that night, and what he saw just didn't add up to a fame seeker. Not at all. Programmed. I mean, think about that word. That's a really strange and powerful word for a detective to use. O'Connor said Chapman showed zero emotion. He didn't want to talk to the press, and it seemed like he was in some kind of trance. This observation, coming from the lead detective on the case, is really the first seed of a wild conspiracy theory. And that one word, programmed, brings us to the core of an explosive theory from journalist Fenton Bressler. To even begin to understand it, we have to rewind and look at John Lennon not as a musician, but as a political threat that the US government took very, very seriously. So Bressler's theory isn't just about a run-of-the-mill conspiracy. No, it's about a very specific kind. It suggests that Mark David Chapman was basically a Manchurian candidate, a mind-controlled assassin, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by powerful people who wanted Lennon silenced for good. But why on earth would they go to those lengths? Well, because to powerful figures like Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, Lennon wasn't just a guy who sang Imagine. He was a massively influential anti-war activist who could speak directly to millions of young, impressionable minds. To them, he was a dangerous radical, an insidious subversive, whose influence was a real threat to their power. And this wasn't just paranoia. The government's own files show their obsession. For 7 years, the FBI and CIA were all over him. His phone was tapped, he was followed constantly. It got so intense that Lennon told friends he was afraid he was going to be killed. Then, in 1976, he steps away from public life, becomes a recluse, and the surveillance stops. But the moment he comes back in 1980 with a new album, he's dead within months. The timing is unsettling. Okay, so for a conspiracy this big to actually work, the assassin can't just be some random guy. He has to be something else. So let's start peeling back some of the myths we all believe about Mark David Chapman. First off, this whole idea that he was a deranged fan, the evidence shows he was anything but. He was described as a pretty cynical guy. And get this, his actual musical hero was Todd Rundgren, an artist known for being kind of an anti-star, a world away from Lennon's global mega fame. And what about The Catcher in the Rye, the book he was holding? According to Bressler's research, Chapman never really showed any special interest in that novel until right before the murder. This has led to the truly chilling idea that the book wasn't a motive. It was a post-hypnotic trigger, used to activate his programming. The image we have of Chapman as this social outcast also kind of falls apart. For a lot of his life, he was apparently a very sociable, well-liked camp counselor who was great with kids. That just doesn't fit the classic loner profile we associate with these kinds of killers. And then you get to the really weird, unexplained parts of his life, like a trip he took with the YMCA to Beirut, right in the middle of the Lebanese Civil War. Now, Bresler argues this trip to a war zone was no accident. He says it was the perfect place for a so-called gentle soul to be blooded, a term for being desensitized to violence. A pretty crucial step if you're trying to create an assassin. So, where does all this leave us? We've got a government with a clear motive, an assassin who doesn't fit the official profile at all, and a lot of very strange circumstances. But does that add up to a conspiracy? Well, this is where things get really murky. And we have to be really clear about this. There is no smoking gun. The hard evidence, the paper trail you'd want to see, is incredibly thin. The main piece of physical evidence that even hints at a conspiracy is an altered airline ticket found in Chapman's hotel room, which seems to hide his real travel itinerary. It's a fascinating clue, but it's a long way from proof. But maybe the most bizarre piece of this whole puzzle is what happened right before the trial. Just as his lawyer was building a pretty solid defense, Chapman suddenly changes his plea to guilty. And his reason? He said he was following instructions from a small male voice he heard in his cell. By doing this, he avoided a public trial, which would have put all this strange evidence and all these weird circumstances under a microscope for the world to see. So, to sum it all up, the physical evidence for a conspiracy, it's weak, let's be honest. But the context of government paranoia? That's undeniable. The assassin himself is a man of just deep contradictions. And his last-minute decision to plead guilty to shut it all down remains deeply, deeply suspicious. So, in the end, you're left with two totally different stories. Was Mark David Chapman just a disturbed man who killed for his 15 minutes of fame, a sad but simple case? Or was he a programmed tool in a political assassination, a crime that has been hiding in plain sight for over 40 years? The official story is written in the history books, but the questions, they're still hanging in the air.